Study Section 3, Agricultural Sector. Introduction. In the past, agriculture was the mainstay of Nigerian economy. However, the discovery of oil and its large production have taken over the center stage as the mainstay of Nigerian economy till date. In this study section, you will be exposed to historical background of agriculture in Nigeria, roles, problems and various agricultural programs and policies in Nigeria. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study section, you should be able to discuss the history of agriculture in Nigeria till date, appraise the role of agriculture to our economy, discuss problems affecting agriculture in Nigeria, explain some agricultural programs and policies in Nigeria. Nigeria is abundantly endowed with natural resources and a mild tropical climate with all year-round high temperatures, which do not pose any serious constraint to the growth of agricultural crops. The importance of agriculture as a sector of the economy is divine and indispensable because it remains the only source of food and natural fiber for man. Agricultural sector in the broad sense includes direct production of arable crops, tree crops, livestock, fish, snail and processing of agricultural products as well as associated research. In terms of natural resources, the country can boast of 1. A large expanse of relatively fertile land capable of supporting varieties of tropical and subtropical crops. 2. A large number of all-season rivers and a coastline of some 60 kilometers bordering the Atlantic Ocean. And 3. Abundant rainfall that is fairly well distributed across the country all the year round. The above natural endowment is capable of sustaining a wide variety of livestock, fish and forest products as well as wildlife in addition to the wide variety of crops. With all this endowment, Nigeria as an agrarian society is too rich to be poor. Historical background of Nigerian agriculture. The agricultural history of Nigeria is intertwined with its political history. This will be examined within the context of the varying constitutional frameworks, viz. Colonial, pre-independence, and the post-1960 period. Agriculture in Nigeria colonial era. The period of the colonial administration in Nigeria, 1861 to 1960, was punctuated by rather ad hoc attention to agricultural development. During the era, considerable emphasis was placed on research and extension services. The first notable activity of the era was the establishment of a botanical research station in Lagos by Sir Claude MacDonald in 1893. This was followed by the acquisition of 10.4 kilometers of land in 1899 by the British Cotton Growing Association (BCGA) for experimental work on cotton and named the experimental area More Plantation in Ibadan. In 1912, a Department of Agriculture was established in each of the then southern and northern Nigerian, but the activities of the department were virtually suspended between 1913 and 1921 as a result of the First World War and its aftermath. Livestock. Livestock production in Nigeria was dominated by nomadic pastoralism long before the advent of the British colonial administration. The immediate interest of the colonial government in livestock was the health and hygiene of the domesticated cattle. Thus, the Nigerian Veterinary Department was established in 1914 with its headquarters at Zaria. In 1924, a small veterinary laboratory was established in Vom for the production of rinderpest serum, Increased feed services raised the demands of the laboratory, hence the production of vaccines and other biological products was added to the functions of the laboratory. The recognition of the advantages of VOM as the Center for Veterinary Research and for vaccine production, coupled with the major emphasis on the health aspect of livestock production, led to the transfer of the headquarters of the Nigerian Veterinary Department from Zaria to VOM. In October 1927, proposals for the establishment of a stock farm were made to the government. The stated objective was to turn out, by purely selective breeding, male stock for use as stored by native stock owners. It was proposed that 3 breeds, namely the White Fulani, Gudali, and Shuwa, represented by a dairy herd of about 20 heads, each be stocked at Shika. By 1934, it was fairly certain that either sweet potatoes or cassava could be fed to the cattle as sources of energy. At about that time too, it was realized that there is a heavy and growing export of cattle of the hoof from the north, and the intensity of this demand naturally fluctuated with the price of southern produce. Thus, with price ruling high for palm oil in the south and low for cotton in the north, a prospective farmer is subjected to variations in his cost and returns. Such variations urged the planners to introduce the mixed farming policy. The policy was typified by the importation of 6 pullets and 1 cockerel of the Rhode Island red breed from England in 1933 to Agege, where crops like maize, cassava, yam, oil palm, cola, coffee, pineapple, and citrus fruits were already cultivated. The role of educational advancement in agricultural development in Nigeria was given prominence at an earlier stage. The value of an elementary education in the 3 regions to farmers was appreciated, and it was suggested that the introduction of a new interest into farming, such as the production of livestock in the southern provinces of Nigeria, would attract more educated youth into agriculture. A scheme was started in Katsina province for teaching sons of farmers the best husbandry methods. Instructions were essentially practical in nature and were centered on mixed farming. Similarly, the study of management of livestock was introduced to the Ibadan Agricultural School, where the Education and Agricultural Department cooperated to train both teachers responsible for the management of school farms and the agricultural assistants for the Department of Agriculture. By 1938, 3 conferences of West African agricultural officers had been held. Besides, the numerous attempts made between 1924 and 1938 to introduce fodder and browse plants into Nigeria, especially at the veterinary station, VOM, the agricultural station at Shamaru, and at the stock center at Shika, were reviewed. The need for concerted effort at pasture and grassland management and improvement was adequately documented, and a call for more cooperation between the livestock farmers and the traditional agriculturists was made. This was the beginning of organized effort towards range management for livestock improvement in investment. In 1940, milk buying units were established in areas of the Jos Plateau, and butter was produced on a commercial scale. The production of cheese and bacon was undertaken shortly after, and this became intensified during the Second World War. After the war, livestock produce assumed considerable importance, while in 1948 the operations were taken over by the Department of Commerce and Industry. A veterinary school was established at VOM in the early 1940s to train Nigerians for animal health work. A livestock investigation center, LIC, was also set up as auxiliary to the school and laboratory. Later, An egg production unit was created to supply fertile eggs for various research, vaccine for both the veterinary and the medical department, and poultry for research work and vaccine testing. The Nigerian Veterinary Department played a very prominent role in the early history of livestock development in Nigeria. Indeed, by the end of the 1939 to 1945 war, the department had become internationally recognized and requests were made by the administration of most of the other West African territories to the veterinary laboratory involved for the supply of vaccines. The serious nature of trypanosomiasis, sleeping sickness, in man and animals was also of great concern of the colonial administration in the West African territories, and the need to control this disease led to the establishment in 1947 of a West African Institute for Trypanosomiasis Research, WAITR. A main laboratory to study the animal was sited in Vom on the Jos Plateau, an ideal location since the tsetse vector was absent in that area. Prior to 1951, the Nigerian Veterinary Department had its headquarters, laboratories, and a school in Vom with field offices in each region. With the coming of regional government, the Nigerian Veterinary Department was split into separate regional departments. The Director of Veterinary Services became the Inspector General of Animal Health Services, while the designation of the regional heads remained the same, except for that of Northern Regional, which was changed to Director of Veterinary Services. The post of Inspector General carried executive authority in the regions only insofar as matters connected with hides and skins trades were concerned. In October 1954, with the introduction of a new constitution, the regional department became completely autonomous. The post of the Inspector General of Animal Health Services was redesignated as the Director of Veterinary Research, responsible to the federal government and with executive authority to veterinary matters in Lagos. From the early 1920s to the mid-1930s, there was a resurgence of activities, and this period has been called the Faulkner Strip Layout era in honor of the Director of Agriculture, Mr. O.T. Faulkner, who devised a statistical design for experimental trials in green manuring, fertilizer project, rotational cropping systems, and livestock feeding. From the late 1930s to the mid-1940s, there was significant intensification and expansion of research activities and extension and training programs of the agricultural department. Additional facilities for training of junior staff in agriculture were provided, as well as scholarships for agricultural students in Yaba Aya College of Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture in Trinidad. The intensification of hostilities during the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, led to the slowing down of activities and the call to the Department of Agriculture to play increasing roles in the production of food for the army and civilians in the country and the empire. Production of export crops like palm products and rubber, which could not be obtained from Malaysia as a result of Japanese war activities in Southeast Asia, and such food items as sugar, wheat, milk, eggs, vegetables, Irish potatoes, and rice, whose importation was prevented by naval blockade of the high seas increased. A special production section of the Department of Agriculture was set up to deal with the situation. On the research side, attention was devoted largely to the possibilities of evolving permanent systems of agriculture that were capable of replacing rotational bush fallowing systems prevalent in the country and realizing the promises of mixed farming in the north. During this period, the WAIFOR, West African Institute for Oil Palm Research in Benin, was started and the research on cocoa was intensified at more plantation. Owena near Ondo and at Onigambari near Ibadan. Achievements of the period include the development of alien cotton in the south, rice cultivation in the Sokoto, Niger, Ilorin, Abeokuta, Colony and Ondo provinces, the introduction of wheat cultivation in the more northern part of the northern provinces, the expansion of production of such export crops as cocoa, oil palm, and groundnut, development of agricultural implements as well as designing farm buildings, intensification of horticultural activities, the development of a marketing section of the department, the extension of the produce inspection service to cover all principal export crops, investigations into the possibilities for organized land settlement schemes, and investigation into the possibilities of irrigation in northern Nigeria. Agriculture in pre-independence period. The period of internal self-government, 1951 to 1960, began with the regionalization of the Department of Agriculture in 1951, with a director and an inspector general of agriculture in each region. By October 1954, the post of Inspector General of Agriculture was abolished as a result of constitutional development which led to independence of the regional departments. The Federal Department of Agricultural Research was retained since constitutional province placed agricultural research on the concurrent legislative list, while extension work remained a regional responsibility. The research findings of the federal research stations were to be transmitted through regional ministries responsible for agriculture and natural resources. There was also the setting up in 1955 of a technical committee of the Council of Natural Resources made up of federal and regional ministers and officials for the formulation of national research programs as well as the coordination of federal and regional research activities. Regionalization of agriculture created a great awareness of the need for intensification of activities in both the research and extension fields. This led the regions to expand considerably their research and extension activities in agriculture. Question: in what year did regionalization in the Department of Agriculture took place during the pre-independence era? Feedback: it took place in the year 1951. Fisheries. The history of fisheries development in Nigeria is a comparatively recent one, although reports have shown that a fishing company operated from the coastal waters of Lagos long before 1915. Deliberate effort at developing the country's fisheries can be said to date back to the Second World War, when, because of the naval blockade of the high seas, the then colonial administration decided to develop the country's local resources, including fisheries. A fisheries organization was established in 1941 as a fisheries development branch of the Agriculture Department of the Colonial Office, and a senior agricultural officer was appointed to conduct a survey of the industry and its possibilities. The headquarters was sited at Akpese village and later at Onikan in Lagos, from where, assisted by a part-time voluntary officer, preliminary experiments in fish culture in brackish water ponds at Onikan were carried out and surveys were conducted on the canoe fisheries of Akpese village and Kuramo waters around Victoria Island, Lagos. A small fishery school was also established at Onikan. Early in 1945, the Fisheries Development Branch was temporarily transferred from the Agricultural Department to the Development Branch of the Secretariat. A fisheries development officer was appointed and a 5-year plan for fisheries development was formulated and incorporated in the 10-year plan of development and welfare in Nigeria laid on the table of the Legislative Council of the 13th December 1945. From this date to 1947, the branch became a section of the Department of Commerce and Industries with a principal fisheries officer in charge. In addition to the brackish water fish culture experiment and canoe fisheries surveys, other activities were initiated. Small motor fishing crafts were acquired for exploratory fishing in the estuaries, lagoons, and creeks. It was considered that treatment should become, at this stage in Nigeria, overseas fisheries. This was in spite of the earlier report of the fishing company which showed that suitable trawling grounds existed off Lagos at depths of 18 to 65 meters. Other activities undertaken included tests of rice growing in Tilda mangrove swamps, where such an activity could be combined with fish farming and improvement in the social conditions of the only fishermen populations of 2 small villages in Lagos. Between 1948 and 1950, major efforts were made at extending the artisanal fisheries program to other coastal areas of Nigeria. An active extension service was established to demonstrate the benefit of improved fishing techniques and geared to the coastal canoe fisherman. In addition, trawling surveys were undertaken in the vicinity of Lagos and Cameroons, and a substation was maintained at Opobo for several years before it was closed down due to lack of funds and personnel. A start was also made in fish culture in inland areas by the construction of experimental ponds and the stocking of the then existing ponds and reservoirs. A fish farmer was appointed to extend this aspect of production, and this culminated in the establishment in 1951 of a 160-acre industrial-scale fish farm at Panyan on the Jos Plateau. By the end of this period, the branch had grown to become the Federal Fisheries Services under the Federal Ministry of Economic Development. Between 1952 and 1957, the bulk of the marine biological research was performed by the West African Fisheries Research Institute, WAFRI. At Freetown, Sierra Leone, a unit was maintained at Benin to conduct research into the fisheries of River Sokoto. In consequence of Nigeria's and Ghana's withdrawal of their support, the WAFRI was disbanded with effect from 31st March 1957. The fisheries research activities of the Federal Fisheries Service were expanded to take care of this function. Under the 1954 Constitution of Nigeria, the fisheries organization was split between the federal and regional government. The Federal Fisheries Service of the Federal Ministry of Economic Department was headed by a director with laboratories and headquarters in Lagos. The Western Region Fishery Division of the Ministry of Agriculture and Natural Resources was headed by a principal fisheries officer. Its headquarters and offices were at Ibadan, and a sea fisheries section at Lagos, a marketing and distribution section at Warri, organization and inspectorate at Epe, and fish culture section at Ibadan and Asaba. The Eastern Region Fisheries Division of the Ministry of Agriculture was under the charge of a principal fishery officer and the headquarters at Aba and an outstation at Opobo. The Fisheries Section of the Ministry of Agriculture of the Northern Region was under the charge of a senior fishery officer, while the headquarters was located first at Baga and later at Malamfatori, Lake Chad. In addition, the Northern Region Fish Farm at Panyam was placed under the administration of the region's Ministry of Trade and Industry and was under the charge of a resident fish farmer. The Federal Fisheries Service had the constitutional responsibility for fisheries development and research in the Lagos Federal Territory and research in any other part of the country where the regional government invited it to carry out any specific research activity. In practice, however, the Western Region Sea Fisheries Section in Lagos, sited in the same compound as the Federal Fisheries Service, catered for all fishermen, whatever their origin and whether they actually lived in Western Region Territory or in the Federal Territory. So the Federal Fisheries Service left all Lagos fishery development work to the Western Region Fishery Division. It concerned itself instead with the development of the modern fishing vessels, trawlers, including their licensing, the planning of a fishing terminal for Lagos, and also with research. The regions never requested federal assistance towards research. They either tried to conduct research themselves or asked for international multilateral FAO/UNDP or bilateral USAID help. Thus, the Federal Fisheries Service had to, on its own initiative, identify regional research needs and carry out what studies it felt were needed. On such initiatives, the Malamfatori Station was established on the Lake Chad. The brackish water fish farming project was developed at Buguma, and studies were initiated at the Kanji Dam site. The period 1956 to 1966 witnessed great expansion in Nigeria's fishing activities. In the coastal trawler fleet, from a single registered trawler in 1956, the fleet was built up by 1960 to 13, while the total fish catch increased tenfold during the period. This level of production was sustained up to 1963, but catches fell in 1964 to 1966, following heavier exploitation of the Lagos fishing grounds. By this period, however, commercial quantities of prawns had been discovered in the eastern part of the country, and many of the vessels converted to prawn fishing, thus reducing the pressure on the fish stock. By 1970, the fish stock had fully recovered and the expansion of inshore fishing activities was becoming so rapid that plans were then made to regulate fishing in order to conserve the rather limited resources. This had been attributed to the concentration of fishing activities close to the rich grounds, higher money returns for effort, general improvement in processing, storage and distribution method, improvement in the type of fishing craft used, and especially to the higher gear efficiency due to a complete changeover to synthetic fiber. The general result was that the contribution of fisheries to the country's QDP quadrupled between 1960 and 1970. Fisheries Service left all Lagos fisheries development work to the Western Region Fisheries Division. It concerned itself, instead, with the development of the modern fishing vessels, trawlers, including their licensing, the planning of a fishing terminal for Lagos, and also with research. The regions never requested federal assistance towards research. They either tried to conduct research themselves or asked for international multilateral FAO/UNDP or bilateral USAID help. Thus, the Federal Fisheries Service had to, on its own initiative, identify regional research needs and carry out what studies it felt were needed. On such initiatives, The Malafatory station was established on the Lake Chad. The brackish water fish farming project was developed at Buguma. The period 1956 to 1966 witnessed great expansion in Nigerian fishing activities. In the coastal trawler fleet, from a single registered trawler in 1956, the fleet was built up by 1960 to 13, while the total fish catch increased tenfold during the period. This level of production was sustained up to 1963, but catches fell in 1964 to 1966, following heavier exploitation of the Lagos fishing grounds. By this period, however, commercial quantities of prawns had been discovered in the eastern part of the country, and many of the vessels converted to prawn fishing, thus reducing the pressure on the fish stock. By 1970, the fish stock had fully recovered and the expansion of inshore fishing activities was becoming so rapid that plans were then made to regulate fishing in order to conserve the rather limited resources. The period also saw a considerable increase in the artisanal fisheries. This has been attributed to the concentration of fishing activities close to the rich grounds, higher money returns for effort, general improvement in processing, storage and distribution methods, improvement in the type of fishing craft used, and especially to the higher gear efficiency due to a complete changeover to synthetic fiber. The general result was that the contribution of fisheries to the country's QDP quadrupled between 1960 and 1970. Post-independence agricultural project. The post-1960 was one of extensive planning and regional competition in agriculture. Concentration of attention on commodity exports, the utilization of taxation policy by the marketing boards as an instrument of development finance, and the belief that food production activities could take care of themselves without any governmental intervention became the official farm policy. Under regional independence, the agricultural history of the nation entered a new phase of modification of traditional practices in view of the incapacity of food production to meet the needs of the rising population and the inability of producers to reinvest in land. These maladies were worsened by the inability of the then federal government to play a leading role in the nation's agricultural modernization. Before the middle of the 1960s, a federal Ministry of Agriculture and Natural Resources was set up, and a phase of consolidation and coordination of projects for agricultural development began. In 1966, federal initiative and control of the nation's agriculture was set in motion. This step in the right direction became more manifest with the creation in 1967 of 12 states and the increased effort to evolve a coordinated perspective for agricultural development in Nigeria. In 1967, when 12 states were created in Nigeria, each state assumed responsibility for veterinary matters within its boundaries. The initial breeding policy designed to improve livestock in Nigeria concentrated on the locally available breeds of animal. About 1950, there was a modification of this policy where exotic breeds of cattle were introduced to upgrade the local stock. The Western Nigeria Development Corporation, WNDC, established the Upper Ogun Ranch for the commercial production and distribution of cattle. In the eastern region, South Devon cattle were introduced at the Obudu Ranch. Friesian bulls were imported to the farm at Agege in Lagos. Teaching and research farm at the University of Ibadan obtained foundation stock of cattle from Shika. Extensive facilities were also established for research in piggery and poultry. The administrative machinery for agricultural development and coordination were also modified. Technical committees established for the various aspects of primary production were modified. The Veterinary Technical Committee was replaced by the enlarged National Livestock Development Committee, which reported to the National Council for Agriculture and Natural Resources. The Livestock Meat Authority, established to serve the northern states, had recently been empowered to act on a national scale in collating data and conducting surveys, as well as in researching into various aspects of livestock production, slaughter, and marketing in Nigeria. The 1962 to 1968 development plans was Nigeria's first national plan. Among several objectives, it emphasized the introduction of more modern agricultural methods through farm settlement, cooperative, nucleus plantations, supply of improved farm implement, e.g. hydraulic hand presses for oil palm processing, and a greatly expanded agricultural extension service. Some of the specialized development schemes initiated or implemented during the period included the following. Number 1, farm settlement schemes, and 2, National Accelerated Food Production Program (NAFPP), launched in 1972. There were also a number of agricultural development intervention experiments, notably 1, Operation Feed the Nation, launched in 1976. 2, River Basin and Rural Development Authorities, established in 1976. 3, Green Revolution Program, inaugurated in 1980. And 4, World Bank funded agricultural projects. While each of the above programs sought to improve food production, the ADPs represented the first major practical demonstration of the integrated approach to agricultural development in Nigeria. The experiment, which started with World Bank funding, with projects at Funtua 1974, Gusau 1974, and Gombe 1974, blossomed into Ayangba 1977, Lafia 1977, Bida 1979, Ilorin 1980, Ekiti Akoko 1981, and Oyo North 1982 agricultural development projects. Following successful negotiations for multi-state agricultural development projects with the World Bank, each state of the country and the federal capital, Abuja, now has one ADP. The years since the early 1960s have also witnessed the establishment of several agricultural research institutes and their extension research license services. Some of the major institutions are 1, Agricultural Extension and Research Stock Production and Fisheries Production in Nigeria License Service, AERLS, at the Amadu in recent years, is presented in the Nestu Sharp Bello University, Zaria, established in 1963. 2, the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, IITA, at Ibadan. And 3, International Livestock Center for Africa, ILCA. Question: which of the following is not an agriculture intervention program? A. Operation Feed the Nation, OFN. B. Green Revolution Program. C. River Basin and Rural Development Authorities. D. Independent Research Commission. Feedback. Option D, because there is no agricultural program in Nigeria that bears the name. Role of agricultural sector in economic development of Nigeria. Theoretically, agriculture derives its importance from the role its growth sets the upper limit to the growth of non-agricultural sectors and to capital formation for economic expansion. The customary role of the sector is in four major areas, namely: A. Provision of food. B. Market contribution. C. Employment contribution. D. Factor contribution, that is land, labor, capital. E. Export and foreign exchange. F. Contribution to GDP. G. Linkage with other sector raw materials. Food and cash crops. The Nigerian agricultural products can be divided into two main groups: food crops produced for home consumption and export products. Prior to the Civil War, the country was self-sufficient in food, but import of food increased substantially after 1973. Bread made primarily from U.S. wheat replaced domestic crops as the cheapest staple food for much of the urban population. The most important food crops are yams and manioc cassava in the south and sorghum, guinea corn, and millet in the north. In 1999, production of yams was 25.1 million tons, 67% of world production. Manioc, 33.1 million tons, highest in the world and 20% of global production. Cocoyam, taro, 3.3 million tons, and sweet potatoes, 1,560,000 tons. The 1999 production estimates for major crops were as follows in thousands of tons: sorghum, 8,443, millet, 5,457, corn, 5,777, rice, 3,399, peanut, 2,783, palm oil, 842, sugar cane, 675, palm kernel, 565, soybeans, 405, and cotton lint, 57. Many fruits and vegetables are also grown by Nigerian farmers. The overall contribution of agriculture to food supply is depicted in the table below. 1980 to 1985. 1985 to 1990. 1990 to 1995. 1995 to 2000. 2001 to 2006. Aggregate agric 2.2 in 1980 to 1985. 10.0 1985 to 1990. 4.7 1990 to 1995. 3.3 in 1995 to 2000. And 4.2 in 2000 to 2006. Crops. (2.1) in 1980 to 1985. 12.3 in 1985 to 1990. 3.3 in 1990 to 1995. 5.2 in 1995 to 2000. 6.1 in 2000 to 2006. Staple crops. 3.3 in 1980 to 1985. 14.0 in 1985 to 1990. 8.4 in 1990 to 1995. 3.1 in 1995 to 2000. 6.1 in 2000 to 2006. Other crops. Minus 0.4 in 1980 to 1985. 6.6 in 1985 to 1990. Minus 0.2 in 1990 to 1995. 6.0 in 1995 to 2000. 6.1 in 2000 to 2006. Employment. Historically, agriculture has been the main employer as most Nigerians depended on agriculture as a secondary source of income. Agriculture is by far the most important sector of Nigeria's economy, engaging about 70% of the labor force. Export and foreign exchange. Agricultural exports, including manufactured food and agricultural products, decreased in quantity after 1970, partly because of the discouraging effect of low world prices. Between 1918 and 1982, the share of agri to export amounted to 1.9% of GDP. During 1985 to 87, import of wheat, corn, rice, and vegetable oil were banned as declining income from oil encouraged greater attention to the agricultural sector. In 1986, government marketing boards were closed down and a free market in all agricultural products was established. In 2000 to 2005, agricultural export totaled $323.5 million and 1.6% of the GDP. Table 3.2 share of agriculture in GDP, import and export, 1980 to 2005. Agri as percent of total GDP. Agri as percent of non-oil GDP. Table 3.2 share of agriculture in GDP, import and export, 1980 to 2005. Agri as percentage of total GDP, 1980 to 1982, 1983 to 1985, 1986 to 1988, 1989 to 1991, 1992 to 1995, 1995 to 1997, 1998 to 2000, 2001 to 2005. Agri as percentage of non-oil GDP, 40.6 in 1980 to 1982, 45.1 in 1983 to 1985, 48.1 in 1986 to 1988, 45.4 in 1989 to 1991, 43.8 in 1992 to 1995, 44.8 in 1995 to 1997, 45.1 in 1998 to 2000, and 45.3 in 2001 to 2005. Agri imports as percentage of total imports, 15.0 in 1980 to 1982, 14.0 in 1983 to 1985, 12.0 in 1986 to 1988, 7.0 in 1989 to 1991, 11.0 in 1992 to 1995, 14.1 in 1995 to 1997, 14.0 in 1998 to 2000, 11.8 in 2000 to 2005. Food import as percentage of total imports, 13.0 in 1980 to 1982, 12.0 in 1983 to 1985, 11.0 in 1986 to 1988, 6.0 in 1989 to 1991, 9.0 in 1992 to 1995, 12.0 in 1995 to 1997, 12.0 in 1998 to 2000, 14.2 in 2001 to 2005. Agri export as percentage of total exports, 1.9 in 1980 to 1982, 2.7 in 1983 to 1985, 4.3 in 1986 to 1988, 2.1 in 1989 to 1991, 2.0 in 1992 to 1995, 1.3 in 1995 to 1997, 1.4 in 1998 to 2000, and 1.6 in 2000 to 2005. Agric export as percentage of non-oil exports. In 1980 to 1982, 81.6 and 63.3 in 1983 to 1985, 73.8 in 1986 to 1988, 54.9 in 1989 to 1991, 55.6 in 1992 to 1995, 27.8 in 1995 to 1997, and 37.6 in 1998 to 2000, 32.94 in 2001 to 2005. Question. List the major classifications of food products in Nigeria. Feedback. The two major classifications of food products in Nigeria are food crops and export crops. Problems of agricultural sector in Nigeria. It should be noted that agriculture has been beset by long-standing problems impeding its productivity and contribution on national aggregate output. Usually, several factors can be said to be responsible for the dismal performance of the Nigerian agricultural sector. Preeminent among these factors is the macroeconomic environment, infrastructural facilities, manpower, skill development, government regulatory policy, and socio-cultural factors. The macroeconomic environment comprises fiscal, monetary, exchange rate, income, and other policies that are used to regulate production activities not only in the agricultural sector but in the other sectors of the economy. Unfortunately, macroeconomic policy outcomes vary greatly depending in part on the policy targets and instruments used. Infrastructural facilities. A. Poor feeder roads and inadequate network within and between the rural areas where agricultural production mainly takes place and the urban areas. B. Lack of appropriate on-farm and off-farm storage facilities. C. The rural electrification programs in Nigeria have not fully taken off as the government battles with supply of electricity in urban areas. D. Irrigation facilities are still very poor despite the existence of River Basin and Rural Development Authorities, RBRDA. E. There are few or no healthcare facilities in the rural areas. F. School, primary and secondary are few in the rural areas, and hence the migration of the youth to the urban areas, among other reasons. Manpower skill development. A. The extension service delivery system still suffers from inadequate number of extension men women. The few ones that are in place lack mobility to improve on extension farmer contact, particularly with the withdrawal of the World Bank support and the federal government counterpart funding to the ADPs. B. The frequency of extension message discovery is limited by poor research situation in universities and research institutes. C. Shortage of experienced professional and technical manpower. D. Able-bodied people are leaving farming to rural areas. Socio-cultural factors. A. The land tenure systems in the South limit land availability to would-be farmers, women, and the landless. B. Arising from religion, women's roles are limited to few activities, hence low returns and low family income. Economic factors. The main issues here are as follows. A. Prices of inputs. The prices fertilized, herbicides, pesticides have risen astronomically. These have limited their adoption and subsequent impact on yield and production levels. B. Unavailability of inputs. C. Wage rates have increased in the rural areas over the years. D. Lack of credit to farmers and hence limited farm size commensurate to what they can afford. When credit is available, the interest is high, thus increasing farmers' cost of production. E. Low participation by the organized private sector in agriculture. F. Lack of good linkages between the farm sector and the industrial sector to generate a demand pull situation which will propel high prices for industrial raw materials. Question. What are the most common problems militating against agricultural practices in Nigeria? Feedback. Problem of oil boom, policy inconsistency, and the decline in political commitment to agricultural and rural development. Agricultural policy and programs. Nigeria's agricultural policy is the synthesis of the framework and action plans of government designed to achieve overall agricultural growth and development. The policy aims at the attainment of self-sustaining growth in all the subsectors of agriculture and the structural transformation necessary for the overall socio-economic development of the country, as well as the improvement in the quality of life of Nigerians. Efforts to fortify the Nigerian agricultural sector have a long history. Broad policy objectives. The broad policy objectives include A. Attainment of self-sufficiency in basic food commodities with particular reference to those which consume considerable shares of Nigerians' foreign exchange and for which the country has comparative advantage in local production. B. Increase in production of agricultural raw materials to meet the growth of an expanding industrial sector. C. Increase in production and processing of exportable commodities with a view to increasing their foreign exchange earning capacity and further diversifying the country's export base and sources of foreign exchange earnings. D. Modernization of agricultural production, processing, storage, and distribution through the infusion of improved technologies and management so that agriculture can be more responsive to the demands of other sectors of the Nigerian economy. Creation of more agricultural and rural employment opportunities to increase the income of farmers and rural dwellers and to productively absorb an increasing labor force in the nation. F. Protection and improvement of agricultural land resources and preservation of the environment for sustainable agricultural production. G. Establishment of appropriate institutions and creation of administrative organs to facilitate the integrated development and realization of the country's agricultural potentials. The sector-specific agricultural policies were largely designed to facilitate agricultural marketing, reduce agricultural production costs, and enhance agricultural product prices as incentives for increased agricultural production. Major policy instruments for this purpose included those targeted to agricultural commodity marketing and pricing, input supply and distribution, input price subsidy, land resource use, agricultural research, agricultural extension and technology transfer, agricultural mechanization, agricultural cooperatives, and agricultural water resource and irrigation development. Agricultural commodity marketing and pricing policy. The major instrument of agricultural commodity marketing and pricing policy was the establishment of 6 national commodity boards in 1977 to replace the regional multi-commodity boards that had been operating since 1954. The 6 new national commodity boards were for cocoa, groundnut, palm produce, cotton, rubber, and food grains. The policy is set to administer a guaranteed minimum price policy whereby floor prices were nationally set for each of the 6 grain crops, and the board would intervene as a buyer of last resort if and when their regular market prices fell below the guaranteed minimum. The board also operated a strategic grain reserve scheme. Input supply and distribution policy. Government policies on input supply and distribution focused on instruments for ensuring the adequate and orderly supply of modern inputs like fertilizers, agrochemicals, seed and seedlings, machinery and equipment, and so on. The key policy instruments adopted were as follows: centralization of fertilizer procurement and distribution in 1975, as a result of which all fertilizer procurement and distribution activities in Nigeria were effectively taken over by the federal government. Also, the federal government established a superphosphate fertilizer plant in the country to reduce the country's dependence on foreign sources of fertilizer supply. The creation of a national network of agro-service centers to facilitate the distribution of modern inputs, including the provision of tractor and farm machinery services to farmers. The creation of a national seed service (NSS) in 1972 to produce and multiply the improved seeds of rice, maize, cowpea, millet, sorghum, and wheat, and to multiply cassava. Agricultural input subsidy policy. As far back as the 1950s, various regional governments in Nigeria were already subsidizing the prices of key inputs, especially the prices of agrochemicals used in the production of groundnuts, cotton, cocoa, palm produce, and other export crops. But in the early 1970s, input subsidy policy became centralized and its application extended to food crops. The policy instruments adopted comprised the following: fertilizer subsidy. Between 1976 and 1979, fertilizer attracted a 75% subsidy wholly borne by the federal government. But in 1980, the federal government's share was reduced to 50%, while the states were required to absorb the remaining 25%. However, the total percentage subsidy was subsequently reduced to 50%. Seed subsidy. There was a subsidy of 50% or more on various improved seeds produced by the National Seed Service. Subsidy on agrochemicals. Rates of subsidy on agrochemicals varied but were generally over 50%. Subsidies on tractor hire services. Subsidies on tractor hire services that were mostly operated at the state level ranged from about 25% to about 50% of the actual cost of tractor services. Agricultural mechanization policy. The need for a coherent agricultural mechanization policy became very pressing in the early 1970s in view of an increasing shortage of agricultural labor that necessitated the substitution of some appropriate forms of mechanical power for human labor. In an attempt to achieve the objectives of an agricultural mechanization policy, the following policy instruments were adopted. The operation of tractor hires units by states. Liberalized import policy in respect of tractors and agricultural equipment. Massive assistance program to farmers on land clearing through cost subsidies. The launching of a machinery ownership scheme in 1980, under which the federal government provided half of the purchase cost of farm machinery to be owned as used by farming cooperatives or group farms. Agricultural cooperatives policy. Agricultural cooperatives policy instruments were also adopted to mobilize rural people for social and economic development through agricultural cooperatives. The following were the major instruments. The use of agricultural cooperatives for the distribution of some farm input as well as imported food commodities. The provision of necessary encouragement for the establishment of cooperative farms and other cooperative enterprises. Water resources and irrigation policy. The major instrument of the water resources and irrigation policy was the establishment of 11 RDBAs in 1977 with the overriding responsibility for the development of the country's land and water resources. They had the mandate for land preparation, development of irrigation facilities, and construction of dams, boreholes, and roads. They were also involved in the distribution of farm and fishing inputs. Under the civilian regime between 1979 and 1983, they became the major instrument of government direct agricultural production through large-scale mechanized farming. Institutional framework. To support the macroeconomic and microeconomic policies of government, a number of institutions were created. The major ones were the institutions created for credit supply to farmers, technology transfer, improved seed supply, agricultural research, agricultural mechanization, and agricultural commodity marketing and pricing. Agricultural Credit Institution. In 1973, the Nigerian Agricultural and Cooperative Bank (NACB) were established as a specialized credit institution for agriculture and rural development. The bank had the mandate to supply credit to small-scale and large-scale farmers, as well as farmer cooperatives and groups on favorable terms. Seed Supply Institution. NSS was created in 1972 to produce and multiply the improved seed of rice, maize, cowpea, millet, sorghum, and wheat, and then multiply cassava. Agricultural Research and Development. The major policy effected in the 1970s concerned the provision of institutional mechanisms for the national coordination of agricultural research and for creating stronger linkages between research and extension services. Question. Discuss briefly the essence of agricultural policies and programs. Feedback. Agricultural programs and policies are put in place by the government so as to enhance the achievement of the overall agricultural growth and development. Studies section summary. In this studies section, we noted that Nigerian agricultural sector is endowed with abundant natural resources and suitable climate and soil condition. Historically, Nigerian agricultural sector has passed through the following stages era, namely colonial era, pre-independence, and the post-1960 periods. Agricultural sector is highly indispensable to national growth. This is the end of section 3. Thanks for listening.